Hello again. In this video I'm going to show you how I made this helmet illustration using Photoshop. So this is a fairly small image. It's 900 by 900, and I start by sketching a shape, what I think is, a cool helmet shape. This one looks a little bit modern with the details on the back, so I decided to simplify it to be more like a retro shaped helmet, something you would find like a Bell helmet brand. In this case, I'm doing paths just because I know that they'll come out smoother if I use the pen tool. You can then control click the paths icon or thumbnail for the layer and you'll get the selection off of it. So it's pretty much the same as using selections. I'm setting up now the base of the layers. I will have this shape layer as the base, as a clipping mask for everything that's going to happen above it. All the shadows, all the highlights. And I will be experimenting. What I was just there doing was cleaning up some of the sort of joints in between different selections. Some pixels don't get like 100% selected. And this is just a little chrome trim that I decided to add. Because the angle was so steep, it felt like the helmet shape was a little too modern. So I just made it flatter so it's more retro looking, more vintage. I'm trying to do the shape of the helmet, see if that comes out as an interesting shape for the shadow. I always take the shape of the object before scaling it down, before flattening it down, and make that a blur, and then I flatten it down so that the blur also gets into perspective. These two main layers, the shadow and the light, are the ones that are going to provide basically the shading. And they're pretty simple. The shadow is basically darker at the bottom and the light is brighter at the top, simple. But the whole point of getting this to look realistic is to think about the environment. And we're doing like a studio setting where there's an endless white wall at the back, and that gets reflected onto the object. And that's pretty much what I'm sketching right here. The shapes that it generates based on the curvature of the object and the position of the object in the scene. In this case, I'm going to have this sort of white tapered shape at the top. That's the reflection of the sort of the ceiling of the studio onto the object. And that little dot that I did there was just to show that you get higher contrast on the reflections on the edge because of the Fresnel effect, which is sort of the increase of information near the edges as the object sort of turns away from you. I'm experimenting here a little bit with the blending modes on the layers because even though red is a very interesting color to use because you get a lot of information for shadow, because red being very saturated is actually quite dark, so you get a lot of bang for your buck when you do reflections. But you don't really get those red saturated reflections unless you shift your red into something more like a strawberry or a little bit more like a magma color. The side reflections that I'm using here are basically to represent the lights, sort of the soft lights that usually there are in studios. And the idea of softening them as they come towards the inside of the object is to kind of, again, provide more suggestion of the Fresnel effect. I'm doing a little bit of a bump here where the visor sort of gets bolted onto the helmet. And I was trying to hand paint that, but it turns out it's easier to just smudge the original shape on the top. And the reason for that is you're bringing in the pixels with the opacity that they already had. I'll be working with orange for quite a bit. Orange is also a very strong color. But as you can see, if I play around with the blending modes, and I get my reflections to be duplicated, one as a screen and another one as an overlay, I get that really nice saturated fade on the edges right there. Here's is also me explaining why some of these edges reflect because they're tangent to, they're basically tangent to each other and they're perpendicular to the light direction. On the visor here, I actually just use a little bit of Photoshop blending or layer styles, which is really old school, sort of like vintage boring stuff, but it gets the job done really well. So there's no point in like making it complicated. Here I'm doing a little bit of a noise and then a spin blur, which is also, again, very old school trick. And then I'll sort of dodge a little bit on the edges to sort of suggest that reflection of the brushed metal from the, I guess this is a piece that you would turn in a lathe to sort of get, and that's the effect of like sort of shaving it off. I'm also casting the shadow from the visor onto the helmet. And really all that we're doing here is sort of providing a back for, playing around with graphics later on. As long as the shape that we have looks good enough for us to sort of feel like we're designing in a volume, then that's pretty good. Oh, that was pretty fast, but there's also a really nice trick to get fake chromes, which is to just use the bevel and emboss layer effect. But then instead of having like a linear ramp from dark to bright, you actually create this sort of wavy, you can actually go back and rewatch that. It creates this wavy effect, which plays around with the shades. Instead of just going from black to white and a linear gray, it just goes all over the place and kind of suggests reflection, or suggests this kind of chromy reflections on an object. The interior of the helmet here is basically just a part with no sort of shell where you can see the inside cushioning. And I'm just like doing slight dabs of color in there just to sort of suggest leather puffiness. I also want to poke a little hole on the helmet here. It doesn't really look good because there's a reflection on the hole where it shouldn't be, but I'll just, I just use that. I also take that little screw that helps the visor get attached to the helmet, and use that sort of as a base shape for creating these, like, I think these are like magnetized or little dots that you can kind of like cling a sun shield on. I don't really know for sure, but I liked the detail that I saw it online once, so I thought of trying it out. So this is the part where I get to the graphics. It's basically creating a layer above my base color, which I can then like change to whatever I like, and then I just paint the graphics on it. And because all of the shadows and reflections are above that, the graphics that I put in sort of inherit that sort of information of light. And this is like the homage again to Ayrton Senna, one of my like the coolest helmets ever designed. Here I want to do a metallic flake style. That's what I'm going to end up with. And the way you do that is you have to have a really high saturated noisy effect on the bases. So that's going to have to be something that I put into, it's like an overlay effect that I duplicate, and that almost immediately gives it the metallic look. What really sells it is the adding back of the reflection, the sort of the reflection on top, because that reflection conveys the idea of a clear coat layer. So basically a varnish on top of everything. And I was also not happy that the graphic was getting so burned out. So I basically took the graphic and put it underneath, or sorry, above the overlay reflection for the metallic flake. And this is just like playing around with some like funky graphics on the side. I'm pretty sure you've seen something like this on really old retro bikes, the tricolor adjacent color designs. Yeah, and that's it. I hope you guys enjoy this, and I hope you learned something from it. So take care. Bye-bye.